Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the creation of Charlemagne's empire. Today is episode 3, The Sack of Rome. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, tens of thousands of Goths had been permitted to enter the Eastern Roman Empire because the Huns had made their old neighborhood dangerous. When food supplies did not arrive on schedule, tensions escalated until there was a battle at Adrianople, where Emperor Valens died along with most of his army. Valens' successor Theodosius finally negotiated peace in exchange for greater autonomy for the Goths. Actually, the Goths would provide invaluable manpower when Theodosius dealt with two separate usurpers in the Western Roman Empire. He had gained control of both halves of the empire by 395, but he died. Fortunately, he had two sons. Arcadius, the eldest, would rule in the east, and Honorius received the west, guided by Stilicho, Theodosius's senior general. Meanwhile, the Goths united under Alaric and revolted. Attempts to expand first east and then west failed, so their future outlook appeared grim. Actually, Alaric's Goths were not the only large group of barbarians that was invading the empire, or migrating in search of land and security, depending on your perspective. A Goth named Radagaisus led a force of Goths over the Alps into Italy in 405. Although he was described as a king, almost nothing is known about Radagaisus. The invasion was possible because the border defenses had been weakened, but Stilicho proved able to organize an army quickly. The battle does not seem to have been especially bloody, so it is likely that Stilicho appeared with an army sooner than expected, and Radagaisus' followers were spread out because they lacked the logistics to feed a large army. After Radagaisus was executed, the leaders of the warbands accepted an offer to enlist in the Roman army. While the invasion/armed migration had been resolved relatively smoothly, it was clear that the northern borders required attention. Instead, Stilicho focused his attention on the eastern court, which would soon have consequences in Gaul. It is worth remembering that several usurpers had based their power on support in Gaul, so Stilicho took a gamble when he ignored the region. Just to explain, Gaul was larger than modern-day France since it also included Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and northern Italy. To put it another way, Trier had been the capital of the Western Roman Empire when it was at its peak. Milan had become the new imperial capital, and Arles was clearly replacing Trier as the capital of Gaul. This was a huge shift since Trier was located near the Rhine, basically the northern border, while Arles was at almost the exact opposite location, the mouth of the Rhone River on the edge of the Mediterranean. While it is understandable that bureaucrats may have preferred sunny Provence to cold Trier, the landowners in Gaul understandably felt neglected. Again, resentment would have festered but would not necessarily have become a revolt, especially since Stilicho had recently negotiated treaties with the Franks and the Alemanni who lived across the border. Except, the region experienced a major shock when a mixed group of Germanic Vandals and Sueves and Iranian Alans crossed the Rhine into Gaul just a few months after the victory over Radagaisus. As ever, there is a debate over the dates, but the winter of 405-406 makes sense, and the excuse that the Rhine had frozen seems to be just that, an excuse to explain why a large barbarian coalition could breach the border. First, they had to push their way through the Franks, who naturally defended their lands, but failed without actual support from Roman legions. Well, the military support did arrive, but from Britain, not Italy. A Roman general in Britain declared himself to be Emperor Constantine III, and then led most of the army across the Channel to restore order to much of Gaul. The barbarian invaders were not forced back across the Rhine, but they seem to have been confined, since there is little mention of them for a couple of years. Constantine soon reopened the mint at Trier, which had been closed following the defeat of Eugenius, roughly a decade earlier. Still, the region around Arles in the south remained loyal to Honorius, so the question was, what would Stilicho do? Not much. Admittedly, he sent an army to oppose Constantine, but the army was defeated in 408. Constantine offered the possibility of stability, so he was welcomed by the landowners who, unsurprisingly, simply wanted someone, anyone, to defend them. In addition, Constantine negotiated some form of arrangement with the more settled barbarian tribes, the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Alemanni, ensuring that they would not force their way across the border. It is worth pointing out that Constantine was the third usurper who had appeared since Gratian had died in 383. Each one was effective and clearly had local support, as if the Western Roman Empire wanted to be ruled by a local. Well, Stilicho did not seem to care about local desires and seemed to hope that the usurper and the invading coalition would wear each other out. However, the situation became even more complicated when Alaric made another attempt to invade Italy, possibly at the invitation of Stilicho. Why would he possibly consider inviting Alaric? Well, he needed an ally against Constantinople. The provinces of Dacia and Macedonia had been transferred to the Eastern Empire by Theodosius. Now Stilicho wanted them back. Well, he would probably be ignored, unless he had a powerful ally, and Alaric fit the description. While an alliance with the barbarians seemed risky, Stilicho knew that he could do business with Alaric since they had fought together against Eugenius. In addition, Stilicho had a problem in Gaul and needed an army which could be provided by Alaric. Honestly, it would have been simpler to promise lands in Gaul to Alaric, but presumably Stilicho didn't want to. Instead, he seems to have decided to ally with Alaric to take the region where the Goths were living from the Eastern Empire, declare it to be part of the Western Empire, give the Goths clear title to their lands, and then the Goths would help Stilicho settle the problem in Gaul. Admittedly, this plan seems doomed to failure and quite possibly was simply cover for a more audacious plan. It is entirely plausible that Stilicho did not care about Gaul, but planned to leverage an alliance with Alaric to force Arcadius's advisors to submit to Stilicho. His actual plan is unknown since he never made an official offer to the Goths. The only clarity is that Stilicho preferred to conspire with Alaric rather than deal with Gaul. Worse, Stilicho basically refused to do anything other than remain in Italy and plot. Eventually, Alaric grew tired of waiting, so in the spring of 408, he moved to the eastern side of the Alps as if preparing to invade. The pressure on Stilicho was reaching extreme levels, but Alaric sent a message that he would stay on his side of the Alps if he was given 4,000 pounds of gold. That sounds like a lot of gold, but Stilicho somehow convinced the Senate to agree. Having bought peace in Italy, literally, Stilicho attempted to convince Honorius that Stilicho, not the emperor, would go to Constantinople to help settle eastern affairs since Arcadius had died on May 1st, leaving a 7-year-old son. This proposal is honestly bizarre. Gaul was in chaos, and Stilicho wanted to go to Constantinople rather than deal with the revolt in Gaul. It is worth reminding everyone that dealing with revolts was literally part of his job description since he was the generalissimo for the Western Roman Empire. In fact, an army was being gathered to fight Constantine, recruited largely from former followers of Vitigessus. The exact situation is unclear, but they mutinied in August, killing Stilicho's supporters. It is unknown if Honorius was involved in the initial mutiny, but he clearly saw an opportunity to free himself from Stilicho, who had forced the emperor to marry his daughter. The revolts were an ideal opportunity for Honorius to take power from Stilicho since he was 24 by then, but the generalissimo had not indicated any willingness to let the emperor actually rule his empire. A divorce was promptly arranged, so Honorius was a single man again. While Stilicho's daughter was probably unhappy that she was no longer empress, her situation was much better than that of Stilicho's followers who were simply killed. Finally, Stilicho himself was decapitated on August 22, 408. Since his key followers had also been executed, there was no obvious successor as generalissimo. Stilicho had grown up in the Eastern Roman Empire, so his connections were all in the East, which may explain why he was ineffective in the West. To be fair, the situation appears to have been a huge challenge, but Stilicho seems to have been unwilling to do anything. In fact, it is difficult to find any concrete action during the 2 years between that admittedly impressive victory over Radagaisus in 406 and his execution, other than convincing the Senate to pay the Goths a massive ransom. This would not have been a problem if the Western Roman Empire was at peace, but it faced multiple threats. Stilicho's main rival, Olympius, made himself head of the bureaucracy and ended the loose alliance with Alaric. Once again, the Goths were stuck between two empires, and the gold from the ransom would not last long. Aware that his fragile coalition of warbands would soon break apart when the food ran out, Alaric had to focus on one empire or the other. While the Eastern Roman Empire was dealing with a succession crisis, it was still a functioning empire. The same could not be said about the Western Roman Empire, which was dealing with a barbarian invasion, an usurper, and a recent, violent shuffle of the top management. So Alaric chose to march west. Fortunately, the former followers of Radagaisus joined the Goths in the summer of 408. That fall, the combined army marched into Italy. While Honorius remained secure in Ravenna, the Goths rampaged throughout Italy. Actually, it needs to be stressed that the destruction was merely a side effect of the conflict, not the overall goal. Alaric wanted a home for his people where they would be secure and could feed themselves. A siege of Rome produced an even larger ransom, and senators agreed to represent Alaric to the emperor in early 409. The initial envoys were unsuccessful, so Rome was besieged again. Still, Alaric wanted a home, so the next set of envoys to Ravenna were instructed to ask for a territory including Venetia and Dalmatia, as well as annual payments and grain supplies. Once again, Honorius refused to consider the offer. Recognizing that the emperor would not be any help, Alaric spent the fall negotiating with the Senate and arranged for the urban prefect Attalus to become emperor of the Western Roman Empire, joining a crowded field that included Honorius and Constantine III. It is unknown if the Senate genuinely endorsed Alaric's nominee Attalus, or if the senators were persuaded by the presence of armed Goths. But Rome had endured 2 sieges without any help from Honorius, so it would not be a surprise if the senators were willing to consider a change in emperor. Quick side note, Alaric had only been in Italy for a few years and he was already meddling in imperial politics. Most important, he clearly preferred to achieve his goals without violence. Also, it is worth pointing out that while Alaric's power came from his position as king of the Goths, he'd accumulated a number of Roman titles, both in the east and in the west. He was given a military command by Rufinus, but it was not a permanent position. Therefore, a regime change in Constantinople drove him to leave the Eastern Empire because he reverted to his earlier status as a barbarian leader rather than a high-level official with the authority to demand food supplies for his troops. Again, the dates are not clear, but Alaric likely first called himself king in 401 after the leadership change in Constantinople. The reason for the hesitation is clear. There was no room for a king within the empire. So if Alaric called himself a king, he abandoned any attempt to become an official part of the empire. Anyway, Attalus proved to be a bad investment, so Alaric removed him from office in June 410. Following that gesture, Alaric and Honorius met near Ravenna, but the talks failed, so Alaric finally took the big step and occupied Rome. However, he did not remain in Rome for long, leaving after 3 days of looting. The brief occupation may seem strange at first, but Alaric had been laying siege to the city on and off for over a year, so he probably realized that Rome would be a death trap if he stayed too long. While the occupation was undoubtedly extremely profitable, despite the surprisingly short duration, it was probably not very destructive. The Goths were Homoian Christians, admittedly not the Nicene version, but still Christian. So the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul were protected, and offered sanctuary to anyone who reached them. Although a few buildings were destroyed, anything of value that could be moved was taken with the Goths when they left. Again, it needs to be emphasized that the Goths had been living in the empire for more than a generation, and they had waited patiently outside the border while their immigration applications were being processed back in 376. The Goths had been surprisingly disciplined, so it is hard to avoid the conclusion that Alaric had been forced to approve the sack of Rome because his policy of carefully controlled violence as a bargaining tactic had failed. Still, the sack was a profound embarrassment for Honorius. Hard to believe, but the empire had survived this invasion, or more accurately, armed migration. While Rome was still a large city, it had not been the administrative hub of the empire for a century or more. So its sack was not a fatal blow to the Western Roman Empire. In fact, Ravenna had become the leading city in the empire, part of a maritime network that included Antioch, Gaza, and Alexandria. Still, a new generalissimo was needed. Admittedly, it was a bit outside the box, but maybe Constantine or Alaric would be an acceptable option. Constantine was negotiating with Honorius, as was Alaric, but Constantine either interpreted a message from Honorius favorably or simply decided that Honorius did not matter, since he declared himself consul. In the end, Honorius refused to accept either Constantine or Alaric as generalissimo. Fine. But he still failed to find someone who could defeat either. Well, Honorius may have been secure in Ravenna, but he lacked an army to enforce his will. Actually, there was an army, but it was busy on the border with Gaul, making sure that Constantine did not enter Italy. To be fair, the usurper seems to have been relatively effective, since the Vandal coalition had moved south. When they reached the Pyrenees in 409, the troops guarding the passes let them through, which sounds like the commander decided that someone would have to deal with the barbarians, and better Hispania than Gaul. In case you have lost track, Alaric was running wild in Italy. The Vandal, Alan, and Sueves coalition was wandering around Hispania, and the usurper Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain. The situation did not look good for Honorius. The question is, what would Alaric do next? The Goths marched down to Sicily as a stepping stone for an invasion of North Africa because a general loyal to Honorius controlled North Africa and had cut off the grain supply. Italy could not feed Alaric's army and followers, so he tried to go where the food came from. The Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily is not large, but the fall storms had started and the Goths lacked ships, so they turned around and spent the winter in the region around Naples. Unfortunately, Alaric died before the end of the year. While the sack of Rome had sent shockwaves throughout the empire, Alaric probably considered the last year of his life a failure. His goal had been a secure base for his people, and he had failed to accomplish that goal. To be fair, he had kept his army fed and he had emphasized negotiation over warfare, but he had still left his people in a dangerous situation. To sum up, Stilicho had made himself regent for Honorius, who was too young to rule. More interested in scheming to gain control of the Eastern Roman Empire, Stilicho failed to deal with an usurper in Gaul and a coalition of Vandals, Alan, and Sueves, which had crossed the Rhine. Finally, an adult Honorius had Stilicho executed. However, Alaric took advantage of the confusion to lead his Goths into Italy and sacked Rome when Honorius failed to give the Goths their own lands. Fortunately, Alaric died a year after the sack of Rome. Still, the Goths would undoubtedly choose a successor. There was an usurper making himself comfortable in Gaul, and the coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Sueves were wandering around Hispania, so a new generalissimo was required, and I will discuss that generalissimo next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.